Hello, everybody. So delighted that you're here. We've got a lovely session about a very simple word called sustainable governance. And I've got four lovely speakers. I'll just quickly introduce them. There's Professor Jürgen Kegelmann, who researches governance, change management, participation, and things like that, and has done an interesting study looking at the innovativeness of public administrations in Germany. So that's Jürgen. Then we've got Eric Karain, who's a cultural philosopher. That's a very big word, but also professor at the Free University in Brussels. But particularly, he's also, and this I think is quite important, on the advisory board committee of the Global Parliament of Mayors, which, as many of you know, is about who has control, the nation state, the city, and so on. Then we have Susan Pettifer, who's all the way from Sydney, so that's a long, long way away. Thank you for being here. Who's the director in the city for people, performance, and technology. And then finally, there's Mikko Gronholm, who's on holiday. He looks very relaxed, thank God. And he's head of futures at Helsingborg. By the way, if you don't know Helsingborg, it's in Sweden, and it's a very interesting place. I'll leave it like that. His role is, has been to, foster innovation and things like that. And they have won many awards. For example, they were runner-up in the European Capital of Innovation and are finalists of the European Green City Award. There we are. There you have all the participants. Now, I'm going to start off with a question, and Jürgen, I'm going to ask you first, and everybody will have a chance. Is sustainable governance, what the hell is that? If you ask the person in the street, let's talk about sustainable governance, would they know what you're talking about? So could you give a brief description of what you think it is, please?
Yeah, I think the word sustainability is a huge word and everybody uses it in a way. And I think the main usage of sustainability is still right, concerning ecological, economical, and social sustainability. And I think also it's a normative word, because we have this public commonwealth. And so I think it's really a normative way of living in cities or societies. But to become in a way sustainable at the outcome side, you have to also have a sustainable, in a way, administration or organization. Yeah? So the input determines the output or the impact and the outcome. And so I think we have to think about what does sustainable mean in the outcome side, but also what does it need to become sustainable. So that's, for me, in a way, it's a normative word for me, in a way.
All right, now that's interesting. I like the phrase you just used, like public commonwealth. I'll keep that for the discussion as we move on. Eric, what's your take on sustainable governance?
Well, I think sustainability always needs time. And I think one of the interesting subject of discussion is, let's say, the contradiction, so to speak, between, let's say, the electoral rhythms of every 4, 5, or 6 years, and then the necessity of middle term and long term planning to be or to become sustainable. Every transition is longer than the next election, and I think governance is ruled by elections. And in fact, I think to become sustainable, governance has to admit limitations. To be honest, limitations of democracy. If you see the donuts model, for instance, with a ceiling, with environmental criteria and a bottom line, social bottom line, then you have democracy in between those two parameters, and the rest is a question of middle term and long term planning and engagement. And I think there is a real tension with, let's say, the change of opinion in society on the one hand, and then the necessity of some stability of the system. And that's an interesting point in the governance debate.
Well, yeah, perhaps we can explore that a bit further in a second. Susan, over to you. Have you got a different approach? Let's call it that.
I agree with you very much that if you ask people what sustainable governance is, or actually ask people what governance is, they probably couldn't tell you. One of the ways that we talk about it in Sydney is to use it more as a verb rather than a noun, and to talk about governing, and how do we govern, and what does good governing look like. And I think that is a more relatable, people can understand that a little bit more. So I guess my take on it would be, besides the one that Jürgen talked about, which I very much can respond to, the inside matching the outside. I mean, we have that very much, that rhetoric, it needs to be a mirror of what you project and commit to externally, which is social justice, economic sustainability, environmental outcomes. You must reflect internally. I think the second take on it is just to say, well, how can we govern well over the long term sustainably, and what sort of characteristics does an organisation or a public institution need to do that? And I know we'll unpack those things like quality participation, good partnerships, the ability to be able to navigate through complexity, those sorts of aspects.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, I think that's my first little insight, that from governance to governing. So I'm going to keep that in my mind. What about you, Mika? What do you think? What would you say to that, all of this?
I'm totally for the verbification of the phrase, going from thoughts and strategies and things like that to action, because without action, nothing will happen. I actually had to Google the phrase sustainable governance because I couldn't define it myself.
Oh, right.
I was all over the place when I tried to define it. So, but I think, I also think that's quite important to think about, because after all, community means doing things together. And I think that in order to work with sustainable governance, we need to work together, not only within the public sector, but also between public and private sector and academia and so on. So all parts of the community needs to work together. And unless we have a common definition of what we're trying to do, we can't do it together. So yeah. I think it's a good question to start with. How do we define the phrase sustainable governance?
Well, can we just capture the fact that we think it should be a verb, just between us at least, because I find verbs good because they're active, they're dynamic and so on, and they describe a process. I mean, you just mentioned academia. Jürgen, you're an academia, but obviously much more than that. Do we need to, I mean, in Kale, in your institution, I mean, do you teach potential bureaucrats about governance and things like that? And do you think in general, I'm broadening the question now, that we need to teach future bureaucrats differently than before?
Sorry, I had to demute my microphone. Yeah, I completely agree. I think we have to teach in a new way and also new contents, because times are changing. And there is a big organizational theorist named Weik. He said we should delete substantives and only use verbs in organizations, because it's all a process. And I think in the public sector we are more structural, stability orientated, but not process change, and that means also verb orientated. And I think we have to agree that all the things are changing. That means for me in a process, and we are active parts on this process, and how to get or to become good process people, to learn to design process and implement process. I think that's a very, very big task also at the universities, because the people, they learn contents, but not to design and to implement in a good way concerning people and task processes. And so to teach that in a way, and to also to give possibilities to experience processes. Also in the academic world, I think that's a very important development also at the universities. So we have to change in the way contents, becoming more work orientated, but also processes and didactics, because you also become more process orientated in the teachings.
Right. That's interesting. So we've got a few things: the verb, we've got the long-term issue, we've got the process. I'm just trying to capture what's happening at the moment. Eric,
Charles, can I just say something? Can I just jump in? I think Jürgen's my new best friend, so I'm going to be following him because he's saying so many things that resonate with me. And I just wanted to add to that. We talk about bureaucrats, needing systems thinking, long-term horizon, more of the perspective, dynamics into pattern. But I think what we need is systems doing. Yeah, people who know actually how to do this stuff. Yeah, and so what you just said is my reframe on that, Jürgen.
Oh, well, that's great. I'm glad you've met. So that's good. Anyone jump in at any time,
yes,
by the way.
I would build on that with the question on on teaching and the role of universities and science. I really do think that the universities are not adapted to the challenges of this world. And why are they not adapted? Because the dominant paradigm is a positivist science that is oriented to analysis, description of an external object. And one of the things, of course, that we need to focus at is the dynamics of a system, the systemic dynamics. And that what we do in our teaching is to focus on research by design. That is it's not about action immediately, because action is, of course, civil society, politics, etc. I don't think, but the role of science is to inform possible actions, and I don't think that description only informs what to do, and that has, of course, a counterpart in the dominant government models, which are, let's say, measure-based and not mission-based, not vision-based. And I think we have to really radically change practices, both in the university and also in urban governance, oriented to design, future-oriented change, transition. And I think science should inform that, and then politics should lead that. And one of the things which we have to discuss, I think, is this change from government to governance, which means that the mayor is not, let's say, the holder of power because he's elected and then doing the thing with the system, but he must become a leader of actions of other people, civil society, private partners, etc. So the collaboration should be led, because I'm very much for public-private collaboration and partnership, but I still think that the leadership should be the political elected people. I think the frame is a democratic frame that has to orient all individual or particular actions. But from the point of view of universities, we have to radically change our opinion about science and go for dynamics, design, and do that also in the social sciences, which are too positivistic.
What's interesting here is that we're basically saying that nearly everything needs to change. We're saying universities need to change the way they teach. We're saying cities need to change the way they organize. We're saying everybody needs to change the way they think. But there was a good bridge there you just made, because you were talking about mission-oriented thinking and so on, not thinking, but also doing. That brings me to Mikko, who was, or is until the end of July, head of futures at Helsingborg. I mean, how do you respond to those things that have just been said, Mikko?
I totally agree. I'm happy to hear that. The thing is that I think that in governing municipalities, there have been much too much focus on how to do things. The managers have tried to describe, to the employees how to solve different problems instead of focusing on the vision. What are we aiming for? What are we trying to achieve in the long term? And giving the possibility both for employees of the municipality, but also for citizens, I mean the inhabitants of the municipality, companies, the freedom to try to solve those problems within the framework of the vision. And the problem that occurs, which is quite tricky in terms of political organizations, is that the only way to succeed is by testing and learning. And when you test and learn, you will do mistakes. And mistakes, by default, is something very bad in a municipality, in a politically steered organization, which means that I think that one of the biggest obstacles we have in front of us is actually the fear of failure of the organization. Unless we can tackle the fear of failure of the organization, we can't really do these new things and the innovations needed to become sustainable societies. So our main focus has been to focus on how can we fight the fear of failure in the organization, which is basically a management issue, but also how can we transform the municipality from being a producer of services to being a facilitator. And that has been the main aim for everything we do in Helsingborg. So I totally agree with Eric and you. This is quite boring because we agree. Can't we be?
No. Let's disagree. No. Okay.
I want somebody to disagree.
But can I bring in Jürgen and then Susan? I mean, Jürgen, in your teaching, I mean, does some of the stuff that Eric and Mikko is saying, does that relate to what you're trying to do?
Yeah, of course, sure. What I see, I did in my PhD, I thought a lot about organizational culture. Yeah, as a culture is the main word for me. And you have these different levels, yeah, of the behavior level, then the normative level. But on the third level, you have these mental paradigms. And I'm completely convinced that we still live in Newton times where we have other paradigms and we have to change. And that also means completely changing also about thinking and also doing. And of course, we learn, yeah, to be stable and not to make mistakes, yeah, to obey in a way, yeah, all these things, yeah. That's also again structure orientated. But if you go away and sometimes you don't know which way you have to go, then that means that you also make mistakes, that you go wrong way, and that's in a way human, yeah. And so you have to also deal in organizations with things that you say, okay, we make mistakes, yeah, but only if you don't go anyway, we do no mistakes, yeah. And also in studying, yeah, also what we teach and also these accents, for example, yeah, to say it's good or wrong or right, that's not the challenge for the future, yeah. You have to become a systemic thinker on attitudes, based on attitudes and values, and then you create this world, yeah. And so we have a very main role, yeah, in designing a future, but that also means making mistakes. Yeah? So I completely agree also with Mikko. That's the point.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Susan. I mean, there are two things coming up. One is, in a sense, the ethical framework, in a way, what I believe Jürgen is calling normative. But there's also this trialing and doing and testing and so on. How do you respond to all that, Susan?
I would totally agree with the concept of, purpose-driven first. And I think, the City of Sydney, we've had the same Lord Mayor and same CEO now for 4 terms. And it's a very purpose-driven organisation with a very clear platform of environmental and social justice initiatives. And that really has served our organisation extremely well, and our partnerships with, civil society and the business sector as well. And the council as facilitator, or the institution, city as facilitator, very much resonates. The fear of failure as a bureaucrat is hard. As somebody who's practicing in that way, that unfortunately the daily newspapers don't take the same attitude as we do around the table. And they take great delight at putting even very small failures on the front page and turning them into very huge disasters. theoretically, I can totally agree with it, and I can try and coach my staff to agree with it. In practice, it's a little bit harder. But there's one more thing, I think, not just the fear of failure, that in this concept of, a city institution or council as a facilitator, I think it also means power sharing. I think that's a really critical thing to do. And I think it's fine in theory. Again, it's easy to say. It is very hard to do because everybody wants their piece of the pie. And it does to some extent mean not just, learning participatory leadership methods, but also leaving your ego at the door a bit, and it's sort of a bit more of a humble style of leadership. So I think this power sharing is another critical concept.
Can I say something there, Charles?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Susan, we actually have a fear of failure award in Helsingborg. So it's a fail of the year. So you can nominate yourself or a colleague for a really good failure. And it's actually the learning from the failure that is awarded.
Yeah.
And you can get up to 50,000 kronor. That's about 5,000 euros for competence development if you have made a really good failure. That is
Beautiful.
A way for us to actually to show that we mean business. But I agree, the local newspaper tend to create the big things about small learnings instead of looking at them as a positive thing there. And the other thing is that we have I totally agree of the trickiness of doing it in practice. What we've done is that we've actually sent all our 500 plus managers to management courses where they get to practice a new way of management, where we don't have the hierarchy as the model, where we don't have the fear of failure as the norm, but more an innovative and communicative way of management. But also we sent our leading politicians as well to the same team and the union representative. So we have a common kind of language when you talk about management and governance, which makes it a little bit easier to drive the change forward.
I mean, the big issue. You far away.
Because, not to disagree, but this discourse is a bit too much ethical, moral, mentality, etc. I think it's also a question of organization. Most of our cities are organized in thematic, segmented administrations. And the fact that there are bureaucracies is because they are, let's say, doing from 9 to 5 the same things on the same topics with the same methods. And so one of the main things, of course, in project organization is transversal collaboration. It's not just about being in the good spirit. It's about organizing differently projects and putting people of different administrations together, allowing them, for instance, which is in a lot of cities problematic, allowing them to exchange information without asking the permission of the political, or the alderman, or the mayor, or the chief. So this is an administrative and organizational question, and I think really this is the main problem. The main problem is that politically you could have a vision, or you could have a societal orientation, what to do, but then it's translated by administrators in very technocratic ways of doing, which are segmented and fragmented. And I think that's the main obstacle. It's an organizational question, much more than a question of mentality. There are a lot of good administrators that are blocked by the organization. The same goes for universities. I mean, interdisciplinary studies have much more difficulties to find financing and dynamics than faculties and disciplines, and so research is organized through these kind of segmented and fragmented organization systems. So I really think.
I kind of agree. I think that organization is a problem. It's an obstacle. I think, though, that the culture is more important. I think that fostering a culture that is innovative, that has less fear of failure, that there's more, and actually is action-oriented, is the first step. Then the second step is to create an organization that is not an obstacle for the change. So I totally agree that we need to look, we need to go away from these, narrow, exactly, and more look at the whole picture. What we've done here in Helsingborg is we do have departments, but we work with the same assignments, so they work together across organization. But we also have kind of invented a role that in Swedish is called mellanrumsledare. It's almost impossible to translate. It's a leadership in between the organizational, and they have a lot of mandates. So they get a clear assignment to do something, and then they have a lot of they don't have any staff, no budget, but they are like moving in between the organizational spaces. And their mission is basically to connect people with opportunities. And how they do that is by inspiration and irritation. So both
all right,
inspire
we'll keep that phrase, inspiration and irritation.
Yeah. Because you need friction to change.
Yeah, well, I feel Jürgen wants to come in, and then I think also Susan. Jürgen, could you respond a bit on that?
Yeah, that's great. I love this discussion, and we should continue it over this time in this workshop. When we try to look at these cities, municipalities, which we see a little bit as innovative, we say they deal with boundaries. Yeah, and what you say, you design the boundaries because you have to deal with it. Yeah, and what I saw, we have to talk about structures, organizational structures. You have to deal with people, yeah, with motivations, attitudes, and also skills. We have to deal with processes on a very rational levels, and we have to deal with tasks and goals and objectives. Yeah, that was the big frame to look at these municipalities. And what you always saw, that on the structural level, on the behavior, on the people level, on the process level, with a very good design of dealing with boundaries and limitations. Yeah, and that's a very good approach in Helsinki. I love it. I never saw it in Germany right now, but that's the point. But you have to combine structure, people, process, and all within together. That's the culture. Yeah, people, structure, purpose, and processes. That is for me organizational culture as a whole.
Yeah, I just got a message in the chat that if we could speak a slightly bit slower, because not everybody is a native English speaker. So thank you for Sabine Wacker, who just mentioned that point. Susan, any responses to that? What's happening at the moment in our conversation?
I think the friction component of change, is one, worth sort of stressing. I think that if we are going to have this sort of interdisciplinary, both within institutions, but of course people who can boundary ride or cross over boundaries to, non-government organisations, businesses, other sorts of coalitions, then we're by very nature going to have people who can deal with that sort of friction, because people have different mandates, different ways of working, different bosses, different organisational cultures, and they rub up against each other. And I think my experience is that most coalitions fail not because of their commitment to purpose or intention, but because of relationship conflict, because of this friction. Yeah. And so I think if we're going to get good at this stuff, at this concept of sustainable governance, we're going to have to get good at dealing with these complexities of dynamics of relationships, of power dynamics, of dealing with friction. Otherwise, we're not going to have these sustainable multi-sectoral partnerships moving forward.
So in a short while, I'll also bring in some questions from the audience and so on, but I'm just monitoring those. But just thinking, Eric, what we're talking about here obviously is complex, and I think Jürgen summarized it very well about process and structure and all of these things happening simultaneously, the need to have integrated thinking, planning and acting. But do you think doing what is required is easier in the city than from a state? I know that's a simplistic question, but could you respond to that?
Well, yes, my answer is yes. I think that, first of all, more than half of humanity lives in cities today. And in the most developed continents, that is up to 3/4 of the population. So we have become an urban species, and we still think that we are a rural or a suburban species. So one of the changes is to adapt to urban life, and the specificity of urban life is that it is much more complex than the imagined community of a nation state, and that it is territorially differently organized. So one of my publications has the title "A city is not a country," and I think it's very important to grasp that a city. And that's one of our problems also for those who are in public governance studies. The city is mostly bigger than the municipality or than the city organization. So if you want a sustainable transition plan to be made, you have to go for the local ecosystem. And the local ecosystem is larger than the municipality and the competences of the municipality. Secondly, a city is always also a node in a network with other cities, and so the space of flows is hardly studied, is hardly in the consciousness of a mayor. And so one of the big changes, in my view, is that mayors should not be, let's say, local politicians in the nation state, but should be a place in the world which is a nodal place and an ecosystem with their hinterland, which of course raises a number of supplementary questions. If we speak about empowerment, if we speak about development coalitions, so about democracy or widening democracy, is it only the inhabitants of the city or also the users of the city that have to be involved in democratic processes? What about the commuters? What about the visitors? So in fact, in my view, we have to start from a local ecosystem in which the transition can start to take place, where circular economy or foundational economy has a sense, and that's always bigger than the city, the administrative city, and then look at the partners that are necessary. We cannot have an urban agriculture plan or a good food plan in a city only within the built environment. If we don't have an agreement or a cooperation with the hinterland, and so there are territorial aspects. So my point on this is that, let's say, space has to be made part of our analysis, which in social sciences in general and philosophy has not the right place. And if we take space into consideration, we will see that the local ecosystem and the administration is not adapted to each other. And so that a city is also, a mayor of a central city is responsible of making a coalition with the mayors of municipalities in the surrounding and making an integrated transition plan. Otherwise, it has no objective base. And that needs, I think, a lot of change. And to conclude here, it's about politics, of course. If we see the rise of rightist nationalism today, well, that's of course opposed to such a kind of transition. Urbanity is not nationality. Urbanity is a post-national form of living together on the basis of difference and not on the basis of identity. And I mean, all these changes are, in my view, on the agenda, and I really think that what we are going through systemically is a conflict between the city as a node in the space of flows and the immediate environment of suburban living, of middle class conceptions of what is good life, etc. And that tension we have to manage or to think or to analyze more. I think I don't read enough in the literature about these core questions.
Yeah, I mean that overview is obviously re-emphasizing the complexity that Susan talked about, and I want to jump to you, Susan, because the city of Sydney is a big chunk in the middle, and then there are all these other elements of what we think of as Sydney, many of whom I know from what you've told me previously don't necessarily agree with the sort of things you want to do. I mean, how do you manage that thing, you as the city of Sydney, with all of those other elements around it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the city of Sydney in terms of a landmass is actually quite small, but in terms of wealth, it's quite big. Because we have all the big property developers and the headquarters of Asia Pacific companies, all in our LGA. So there is a real disparity between our mass as a population. What Eric talked about, we have the number of residents we have versus the number of users and people who have an active stake, the stakeholders, they work in the city, they make their money in the city, they develop in the city, they commute in the city, whatever, it does mean that we have to do a lot more intersectoral work, I think, than a city that has a bigger footprint, because we can't rely on control alone. We have to pull the strings of influence a lot more. We have to influence other state actors, influence building owners, property owners, businesses, etc., to really have a full impact. And we have been quite successful in also, I guess, being the lead of trying to, pull coalitions together of all of Sydney. I mean, Sydney's big and it's big landmass. So, for example, we're initiated and we auspice Resilient Sydney, which is, was an initiative of 100 resilient cities. I can see people nodding, the Rockefeller Foundation, and that's our way of pulling together all the local government together under one plan. I mean, we have many examples of that, but that's the sort of work, I guess, that's necessary, where your purpose, your intention is larger than your sphere of actual control.
Yeah, that's interesting. Before can I come to Mikko and then to Jürgen? Mikko, you obviously address these issues, that Eric's talking about. There's more than a Helsingborg. There's a bigger Helsingborg out there.
Yeah, it is. I've been reflecting on the fact that cities generally are really bad at cooperating with each other. And that is something we need to improve. We need to be better at cooperating and helping each other. And if one city has come up with solutions, why don't other cities use them as well? Helsingborg is not a big city. It's quite a small city, especially in international terms. In Sweden, we are like I think 8th biggest in Sweden. We only have 150,000 inhabitants in Helsingborg. So it's a small city. So therefore, we are very dependent on our neighbors. And the biggest big city, metropolitan area in our vicinity is actually not Stockholm, it's Copenhagen. And we've been a driving force to create a strong cooperation between the Swedish side of the Öresund and the Danish side. And now we have a very action-oriented cooperation going on between the municipalities in this area. There are actually 60 of them. And we're actually cooperating in a number of very hands-on areas to improve the whole area from a sustainable perspective. So I think that regardless if you're a big city or a small city, I still think the cooperation part it's paramount if you want to succeed.
Yeah, can I just add there, because one of the things that I found impressive, and you can't say this, Mika, because when you go into the website in Helsingborg, it's really offering others to participate collectively with you in identifying problems, thinking things through. And that very open approach, I thought, was you know, I mean, I haven't seen it before in that particular way, but also the way you projected that digitally meant that you as an outsider, even as an individual, but also obviously as another city, felt I can be part of Helsingborg. I can be part of this conversation. So
yeah, true. So we opened up the whole city for everybody else, for the private sector, for other cities to use Helsingborg as a test bed, also to share things with us. And what we do is that we publish everything transparently and openly. And if you're interested, there's a website called innovation.helsingborg.se, where we both have published that we have defined 17 challenges that we are facing at the moment, where we basically say that these challenges, we can't solve them alone. We need help from other cities, from the private sector. But we also publish all the innovation initiatives ongoing in the city. So with personal contact information for each of them. And I think there are 250 or something at the moment, innovation initiatives. And that makes it much easier for anybody, be it an inhabitant or a company or another city, to say, hey, we have an idea, or we have the same problem, or we would like to share this with you. So we can start to collaborate, not just by the word, because I think one problem with collaboration is that we say we want to collaborate, and then we start talking, and nothing happens. And I think the most important thing is that we have the same aim. If we want to collaborate, why do we collaborate? What do we want to achieve? What is the effect we want to achieve with the collaboration? So that's basically what we're trying to do in a very simplified term. Innovation.
So over to you, Jürgen. I mean, I'm sure your ears are really getting very big as you hear these examples. But what do you say to all of that?
Yeah, I say that you have not only municipal or local cultures, you have also national cultures. Yeah, and I have to visit Helsinki or Helsingborg. Helsingborg. Yeah, I just mentioned because we don't have in Germany, I would say, these open culture concerning opinions of citizens, all these things. But in my view, and I really thought a lot about cultures, we have to change cultures as well. So I'm really very impressed, and I think we should share a lot of these ideas because we can learn from each other. So I should visit Helsingborg with my students, or other cities of Germany should come to you, because we have to be more open, in a way. But that's also again a paradigm shift. And so it's a way of culture, but I'm impressed, and I think the future needs it in a way. We talk about this VUCA world, that the world becomes more volatile, ambiguous, complex. And I think the answer on this VUCA world in a way is dealing with change, be open with change, but that means we have to develop new structures. And Helsingborg, that's a very impressive example for me, how you can deal with it.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things that is going through our conversation is obviously this question of changing mindsets, perspectives, and so on. Has anyone got a view on how you actually change a mindset? I mean, I feel partly it's through doing experiments, and doing the experiment changes your mind by the lived experience of doing it. But anyone want to comment on how do you actually flip a mindset?
Yes. Well, I think, of course, there is a big debate in why do people think what they think? Why do people do what they do? And you have, of course, the actor-centrist approaches, and then the structuralist approaches. I really think that from a point of view of politics, changing the environment and changing institutions and the structure helps changing the mindset of people. Why did people stop smoking? Not in the first place because of the campaigns of that is bad for your health, but because there was a law forbidding smoking at workplaces or in public spaces, etc., etc. So I really favor collective, systemic approaches. Now, there is something that helps, of course, cultural changes and mindset, that is diversity. I'm living in a city, 1.2 million inhabitants, the most diverse city of Europe. 2/3 of the population does not have Belgian references. 1/3 of the population does not even have a Belgian identity card. And then, of course, the nations, I mean, the national cultures, there are two official instituted, the Flemish and the French speaking, which are both in a minority in the city. So there is no reference culture. There is no and you say rightly so, Jürgen, there is the national culture, but in Brussels you have 180 national cultures, and they don't help to live together in Brussels. So to become a Brusseler, you have to transcend that and then do something new. Brussels is not a new national culture, is not a new identity. It is a way of living together, of not taking seriously your identity, of accepting the other to exist, of sharing spaces, etc. And so basically, and research underscores that also sharing spaces in diverse settings helps changing minds, working together in a literal, in diverse classes. So we have to, let's say, if we want to do something in that direction, never do something alone. Always take the other and the most different other with you in the project. These are structural elements that can help changing mindsets. And in that sense, I think that the urban condition in Brussels, the extreme right is not a political force. The extreme right is a suburban element. Radicalism and identity politics are suburban elements. So radicalizing, let's say, the deconstruction of one identity in the city is part of the sustainable transition, in my view. We are living 200 years in Brussels, in a divided city, but as opposed to Jerusalem or other cases, there has not been civil war, and that's because of irony. Irony is one of the elements of that mentality, and I really think we have to foster that with arts and initiatives.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Let's keep that word irony in there. Susan, I know that Sydney is obviously very focused on this diversity agenda, obviously because of you've got your version of all these mixes. Does what Eric says resonate with you?
It does, yeah. I mean, I guess I'll deal with it from the point of sort of a practitioner, though, you know, as an administrator. I think, you know, when we're talking about sustainable governance, I think we have to talk about elements of justice. I mean, social sustainability is a key component of sustainable governance. And I think this concept of social justice, I'll call it, both between groups, which I think is what Eric's talking about, as well as, of course, over generations, you know, this future focus. So we're talking about intergenerational justice as well, is really critical. And Sydney, yeah, we've got our challenges, like all cities, in terms of haves and have-nots. We have done some fairly impressive work, I think, at the organisational level. We are leaders in Australia in terms of gender equity, gender equality. And so, for example, we do gender pay equity reviews within our own organisation, and we have a 7% gender pay gap in favour of women, compared to a national pay gap of 14% in favour of men. It's 21% difference. I think Europe sits between about 10%, around about the 10% in favour of men in Northern and Middle Europe, and much higher in Southern Europe. So we've done a lot of systematic work over many, many years on that. We have female mayor, we have a lot of female leaders in the administration, in terms of change that goes to signposting, that we take gender equity importantly. And then we've also done quite a lot of work in terms of cultural diversity. We have obviously a very disadvantaged Indigenous population in Australia. We have a lot of inequity, structural and systematic inequity with those communities that we have to tackle. And this year we were also, the city, our organisation, partnered with another research institution to actually develop a whole standardised approach to measuring cultural diversity across all Australian workplaces, both private and public, and looking at factors that relate to diversity and inclusion and exclusion. Now, why is that all important? Well, because communities that are more unequal have lower levels of trust, they have, more conflict, they have less social capital, and all those things are incredibly important if you want to tackle the hard issues facing our generation. So, we need people being able to put in above and beyond the minimum, Charles, you and I have talked about this concept of effort, discretionary effort, going the mile, putting in the extra, and all the work that we talked about, these coalitions, these partnerships, all require going the extra mile. And that is only, I think, only possible if you've got a sort of baseline of fairness and justice.
Can I pick up that point about fairness? Because what you have told me in the past is when you're doing these shifts in the organizational culture, which is all quite difficult, as we know, that one of the things, just taking the men-women example, that was able to sort of have some traction was saying, is it fair? Fairness was the phrase that you seemed to use, and that seemed to have more power than, let's say, using other words. Is that true?
It is, yeah, and I don't know if that's particularly Australian. We have this word called the fair go, yeah, which is this, give everybody a fair go, or that's not a fair go, mate. So this idea of fairness, we like to think of ourselves as a very egalitarian society. I mean, the truth is we're not so egalitarian when you look at the stats, but it's deeply in our DNA, and so fairness is very much a concept that works for us and resonates a lot more than concepts of justice, although of course they're integral to justice, but fairness it resonates better. Yeah.
Just a question in the chat saying fair go is an Australian expression, which basically means try to be fair. So I'm just trying to think. I think we're slowly building up the elements of what represents sustainable governance. Governing, I've changed to governing. Sorry, thank you, Susan. I'm just going back now to Jürgen, and I'm thinking about his courses and his future administrators. Isn't their head scrambling? Are they finding this too much? Or do they feel this is liberating to be able to think in a way, get insights, more potential, and so on? I mean, what's it like on the ground with these actual future bureaucrats?
I think it's always both. And I love this concept of paradoxities and dilemmata. Yeah? On the one hand, my students, because they work for administrations and municipalities, they like stability, they like clarity, they like structures and all these things. Yeah, but there are quite a few all the time which also likes the opposite. And I think in every person, in a way, there is also these other sides. In my lessons or in my studies, I always try to experience or to make experience experiences with people. And I really experience that the people or the students, because they are still very young, they can develop very, very much. And even if they like stability, they sometimes also love to come into a situation where they don't have stability anymore, in a way. Yeah. And so I think you have to deal with these dilemmas. All the people, all the institutions, they need on the one hand stability in different areas, yeah. But on the other hand, yeah, you said it in Helsingborg, you also have to irritate. Yeah? Sometimes you don't have to be stable, so then you have to change. Yeah, and I think we have to guarantee both in a way. Yeah, so we have to be more able to deal with paradoxes, with dilemmas, yeah? And I think that can really be also very, very funny. Yeah, and so I try to develop the idea that change, irritation can be in a way fun. And I meet a lot of people, yeah, and also I meet institutions where they say, oh, I never thought about it, I never experienced it, and I liked it, even if I'm not used to it.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. I mean, that one needs fluidity and structure at the same time, and that's always the difficulty. I mean, sometimes I say and think when I'm talking with cities that you need to be strategically principled. You know where you're going. This is not quite your point, though, but tactically flexible, which is a version of saying, yes, a bit rigid, but also open. Or, and another way of putting it, when to be open and creative, when to be more focused and more closed. It's completely right. Anyone else want to? I mean, this sounds like a very Helsingborg approach, all of this, doesn't it? Being both open and closed at the same time.
True, that's true. To simplify it, we talk about things that are predictable and not predictable. And things that are predictable, there we can be very organized and structured and doing I often compare the old municipality with Encyclopedia Britannica. A number of experts decide what's the truth, and you can't really comment or challenge it. Whereas the new kind of municipality is more like Wikipedia. But when we have a high degree of unpredictability, when we have wicked problems, and more things are becoming wicked problems, then we have the freedom to actually work without boundaries and test and try and learn. And the trick is not actually to test and try. The trick is to learn, and not only individually but collectively. How can we create systems where we can learn collectively? And I think that's another of these big challenges. Not collectively, not only in the organization or the municipality, but together, maybe globally. How can we learn collectively from our tests and lessons learned?
Yeah, please do.
Susan?
Oh, I was just going to say, just building on what's been said, the balancing between the stable and the dynamic, and it's not my terminology, but this concept of ambidextrous, so both handed. And I think the thing about ambidextrous notion that I quite like is that you can do both at the same time. You can choose to play golf with your right or your left hand. And so it's this ability to switch very quickly between the stable and the dynamic, which I think is the skill, because what presents to you in the first instance is not always the case as you start to uncover some of the complexity or uncertainty. So what you think is stable might be dynamic, and vice versa. I mean, a lot of authors talk about that, mainly in relation to innovation. Of course, this exploits what's existing. But I think we can take this notion a lot broader than that. This ability to balance the short term and the long term, the clear, predictable with the uncertain, unpredictable. It all requires this cognitive and behavioural flexibility, which is challenging.
We can come back to that in a second. I know Jürgen wanted to make a point.
Yeah, again, I think we still think a lot about yes or no in a way, stable or flexible. And I think we have to also to think about neither nor or either or in a way. Yeah. So that's also a mental paradigm. And what I teach, and I did a lot of change management, yeah, in a city and consulting. And we still teach, for example, Levin, yeah, who says this organization socialist, we have to unfreeze, yeah, then change and freeze. That's a paradigm of stability. And in my view, that's not the way. We have all the times we are unstable. So these Levin concepts, which is still teaching, or is taught all the time, is not wrong, but it's only one side of the reality. So I think we really need to think newly about also words, also the word identity. Identity is a fluid concept for me. I change all my life, yeah, and tomorrow I will be a different person than today, yeah, and that's fun for me because change is for me something positive, yeah, and so we still deal with very, very old concepts, yeah, also in dealing with management organizations, and also we are dealing with very, very old mental paradigms, and that's my view. We only can change behavior, organization structure, if we really also make these mental paradigms, this value we deal with we have to become aware of these things.
Yeah, but I mean, that reminds me, and I think you're completely right, is for people to be able to operate both in a very more structured way and a more fluid way, you know, moving between that openness, more closedness, you need to feel ideally more at ease with yourself. And that brings us back to this question of sustainable governing, in my view, because if you look at the literature on what makes people feel at ease, there's things like they have to have the capacity to grow personally, to have some autonomy, some mastery over their own life, all of these things that are not the case if you've got very low incomes, if you're et cetera, in a negative situation. And that then reminds us that one part of our, little mosaic that we're trying to build up of sustainable governing. By the way, we are on this topic, by the way, anyone in the audience, we are talking about this, but, you know, we're going at it from lots of angles. Eric, any points?
Yes, yes, because I agree with everything that has been said, but it's also about politics. I mean, we tend sometimes to discuss it as if it's only a question of technocracy, of analysis of systems, and then open-ended processes. I mean, I know all that, but there is divergence in society. There are different interests. Not everybody is in favor of sustainability because that's against their interest. The choices, the social forces. So democracy has also to do with, let's say, pacifying divergence in a certain way. And I think we are living in a post-political society that is giving too much out of hands to science or to experts or to consultants or to bureaucrats, even as if there is always a neutral position. And I really think that I don't think there is consensus democracy. I really think that there is divergence, and that democracy is also means of letting, let's say, other opinions exist, even if they don't have the action at their side at that moment, but in public opinion or in the media or in transparency. And I really think there is a deficit at that level. That is the deficit of a lack of sound political discussion about. And so if we discuss about missions, visions, etc., it's also about, let's say, societal principles, and we will not agree on that. But let's at least clarify that the different options involve different orientations also.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for bringing up the point about politics. I mean, essentially, you're talking about power, interests, and all of these things, which is obviously either allowing or not allowing this to happen. But I suppose there are two parts of it. There's the political frame, which you're discussing, and then there's the other thing, the mechanisms, all of this complex stuff to organize incredibly difficult things called cities and places and countries at the same time. I mean, just talking about politics, I mean, let me jump to you, Mikko, and then I'll jump to you, Susan, because I'm just dividing you for the moment, the Sydney-siders and the Helsingborgers, who are, who are the administrators. I mean, what about this power question? Did you have any pushback by people? How were you able to, because both of your agendas are about the green transition, you're all positive about that. Did you have any conflicts in relation to the points that Eric's just made? Mikko first.
Of course there's conflicts, but the thing is that the whole journey in Helsingborg started some 10 years ago, when both from the parties in power and both those in opposition decided that let's try to articulate a common vision for Helsingborg. Let's start to articulate envision the future. It's not a slogan vision. It's not like a sentence. It's actually describing Helsingborg from 5 different perspectives. So it's an envisioned future where we describe both actual things that we want to achieve, like we want a tunnel over to Elsinore in Denmark, and we want to be a green city and so on, but also how it will feel to live in Helsingborg. What kind of responsibilities do you have as an inhabitant? And the ambition then was actually to articulate this vision with all parties standing behind it, from the utmost right to the utmost left. And that was actually how I was involved in City of Helsingborg, because I was a consultant before that, and I was hired to help to articulate that vision. And that was a work we did for 1.5 years. And we had some rules in that work. We said that all party political language would be taken out. All parties have specific words, semantics that they like, and instead try to focus on what can we agree upon, what kind of Helsingborg can we agree upon to build. And of course, it was a tricky journey. It took 1.5 years to end up with that vision. But by the autumn of 2012, it was actually unanimously decided by the city council. And that made the platform, the framework, common for everybody. And it wasn't connected to elections each 4 years. And that was, I think that was paramount for the whole journey in Helsingborg, because also it implied we needed to change, not a little, but radically change, both in what we do and how we do it. So, but after that, of course, there's always conflict. I mean, political conflicts, it's good for the society. It's also irritation and friction, but the platform is common.
Yeah. What about you, Susan? I mean, because I know that, just reading yesterday about how close Australia is to the green agenda in comparison to other countries, a bit far behind. So I'm sure some of your ideas, there's some pushback.
Yeah, not with Sydney, I don't think. I think, unfortunately, our there's a gap between city governance and federal government. Yeah. But I'll just leave it there because I'm a bureaucrat.
Yeah, that's fine.
But we went through a very similar process called Sustainable Sydney 2030. And that was started back in about 2008. And very much, a very, very large scale community and civic participation process to develop the vision. And our vision's really summed up in 3 words: green, global, connected. And that again, I think, was because it had so much community participation, and we're just actually going through a refresh of that. We're developing Sustainable Sydney 2050 at the moment. I think it's the quality of the community participation and the garnering of all the different ideas and lack of agreement, the conflicts as well as the consensus across different sectors, which gives the city that firm foundation to move forward, and does, a bit like Mikko said, it does tend to then remove much of the politics in terms of at least the vision. I think the politics come into sometimes the implementation and the various priorities within that implementation and the financing of that implementation. But in terms of the vision, I think that whole strategic planning has served us very, very well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what's quite clear is that sustainable governance is actually a political project, is I think that we're all saying. And the elements hit upon all sorts of points. I think when we look at the 3 legs of sustainability, do we actually also mean the 4 legs, the cultural leg as well? I mean, what do people think about that in terms of pursuing that? Because on the one hand, we've got this big thing, mental mind shifts happening, which is a cultural project to some extent, and then all the other things that we're familiar with, social sustainability and so on. Can anyone make a few comments on that?
Yes, if you want.
Off you go, Eric. I put the word culture in because I know Eric has occasionally things to say about that.
Well, I think in an urban context, and that's again as opposed to a national context, we have to let's say to focus. If we speak about culture, we have to focus on imagining, on this whole field that we have been discussing on visioning, mission, etc. And so that's much broader than the arts sector or the social-cultural sector, and that's the big difference. If I may, the big difference between a city and a country is that a country is a continuity in tradition in a certain way, and that the cultural sphere in a certain way, the identity is a common history, and people are invited to enter a common history. The newcomers, migrants, etc., they have to integrate, if not assimilate. In a city that is not, it's impossible to integrate a city in such a way. And so as opposed to the nation state, a city is integrated in a futures project. And that futures project has no identity, is hybrid, is a bricolage, is to be constructed. And so arts and culture, in my view, are central in the urban project, but not as a repertoire, but as a part of the invention of the creative sector that has to imagine that common future. Because I think that diversity is going to be integrated in the future and not assimilated in the same past. And so in that sense, urbanity, and I don't speak about urbanism, urbanity as a mental state is post-national, but it still has to be constructed and invented, and in each place in its proper way. And so I really put arts and culture at the center if it is not just education, if it is invention, creation, trial and error, and all these aspects. But it is oriented to building a future image as opposed to entering a historic continuity.
So anyone else, what do people disagree? I love the fact that we're broadly agreeing, because at least we're widening our insights. Nico, it seems that you want to have a comment on that.
I'm just saying that was extremely insightful. I love that, Eric. I totally agree.
What about you, Jürgen?
Yeah, I disagree a little, because I also think that the national level is constructed, is invented, is oriented on concerning the future. And so I also would try to reinvent national identity, national future, national history, because all the things are in a way constructed. So I'm not sure whether you can really compare locality and nationally. That for me, it's in a way, there is a big difference. I completely agree, but I also think that we have to rethink national identity, national level, and all these things. When I think about culture, we all think all the time about people. mankind. But if you go to the etymology of this word, it also includes nature, it includes feeling animals. And so I'm again on the point that I think we have to redefine also this word culture, because culture for me is living together in a common world, which includes also nature, animals and all these things. So
all living beings. Yeah,
and that, for example, means that we also have to rethink the word culture. What does we mean by culture?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. This reminds me, I'm going back to Sydney, I'm jumping to Sydney, Susan, that obviously indigenous culture, everything that Jürgen's saying is probably completely embedded in their mindscape. Would you agree, or have I got that wrong?
Look, I certainly think for a non-Indigenous person like myself, that First Nations people's concepts of culture are much more expansive than my own, much more integrated and holistic. Absolutely. And I mean, it's interesting actually, last week was NAIDOC week. So
NAIDOC, what does NAIDOC mean?
Yeah, National Aboriginal and Islander Day of
Celebration.
Yeah, recognition or something like that. Sorry, acknowledgement. Sorry, and the theme of that was heal the country, and this concept, which has been very part of the last week's education and ongoing, is this concept that the country is not just land. But that country has a much bigger concept, and that people belong to the country rather than we own the country, and it includes obviously nature, but you know, and the country is embedded with knowledge, you know, as well, that the country has, you know, has an innate knowledge. So that's a real challenge to someone like me who, you know, is obviously on an ongoing learning journey to try and understand some of this. But yes, it's much broader, and I think that's true of other Indigenous cultures around the world as well. There are, you know, a considerable broadening of a sort of Western mindset.
Yeah, that's clearly for me also about this topic that we're talking about. Can I, because we're slowly moving towards a close, can I just bring up the pandemic, just because inevitably we're living through and within it? Do you think anything that we have discussed has changed or highlighted things or made it easier to talk about sustainable governance and things like that? Has it become more on the agenda? Have politicians grasped it better? I mean, I'm just noticing, because you used the word heal a minute ago. I was in an Inter-American Development Bank event a couple of weeks ago called Healing a Broken World, and I keep on hearing the word healing. So anyway, my question is, does or has the pandemic shifted anything in relation to our topic, for good or for bad?
I'll jump forward because we're living in lockdown right now. Two of Australia's largest cities, Sydney and Melbourne, are in lockdown. So we're stay at home orders back into lockdown. I would say it's made it worse and better. Yep, on different fronts simultaneously. I think in terms of social sustainability and social justice, I think the pandemic has shown everybody that health inequalities are alive, and it's back to the Titanic and the people who, you know, were on the lower decks. Yep, don't get on the life rafts. So I think that's really shown us inequities are alive and well. And it's probably taken that backwards. What I think is improved, speaking from our city's point of view, is the probably the speed to action, the responsiveness, the fact that we have to come up with new solutions. There's no time to worry about failure really, because you have to act, and you have to act with other actors. So I think the cooperation, the speed to action, those sorts of things have really improved.
Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in on that, whether there's been a shift in this? Eric, are you going, or you, whoever wants?
2 points on that. On the one hand, I think that the pandemic showed the necessity of having a state and collective action. And so I think, to speak, I mean, the whole radical, let's say, neoliberal monetary or market philosophy has not been able to regulate such a pandemic. And I think that is clear. There is no intellectual that can sustain that we can live without a state. And so without collective discipline and collective action. And the second point for me is the question of scale. I was really shocked, I have to admit that. There was no extraordinary meeting of the UN. There's no Security Council meeting. I mean, it was a global pandemic. The global institutions did not really react as if we were in a global crisis. It's the nation state that regulated on a territorial basis and on a homogeneous territorial basis. And in reality, it were the big agglomerations where people lived together that had to cope with the crisis and did not always get the competences to locally regulate it. It depended from country to country. And in my view, it stresses again, let's say, that multi-level governance is not yet in the mindset of our political leaders. And thus, in reality, that's my opinion, in reality, the bulk of the power was at the wrong scale. It should have been globally managed with the nodes, the metropolitan nodes, in fact, as a specific, let's say, with specific measures. A lockdown in a whole country is not very rational. We have to lock down cities and then look at the rural areas where the problem is or is not. And so this multi-scalar governance is really a topic that we have to to put in the minds of politicians. And to do that, of course, we have to change, to rethink electorates, because as long as the life of politicians depends on local people electing them in a territorial thing, they will deal with that electorate and not with the systemic, how the system is organized. So that's the 2 points I was really, the first point for me is a positive point, the second is a very problematic.
Yeah. What about you, Jürgen? Any response?
Yeah, my feeling is that on the supranational level, there is a lot of symbol politics. Yeah, it's all true. Healing is a good word. SDGs, yeah, strategic development goals. On these supranational levels, I think there's the awareness, and we can learn a lot on the national and local level, but we don't see the supranational level very often. The municipalities don't know nothing about UNO and all these things. Yeah. Child convention and things, but on the power level, we still have the national level as the main level. Yeah, and I think also we need a states. I'm in a way also a person who likes and who he is positive concerning institutions. Yeah. But we also have to enable and to empower the supranational institutions. And what you saw again, you saw nationalism in a way that it works, but whether it works on the global level, that's still a question. So I agree with you, Eric, and I would divide between symbolism and real power. Yeah? And that's for me what I saw.
So, to Miko now, and then my final question is going to be, because you helpfully raised the UN and the SDGs, of whether in thinking through sustainable governance, the SDGs in any way are a good framework for all of us. So first, Mikko, the pandemic.
The pandemic first?
Yeah, the pandemic first.
Okay.
Then
So
the
the pandemic. Yeah, I would like to answer that question from a totally different perspective, because I think I'm not educated enough to analyze the complications or the implications for governments and cities. But one thing I have noticed is that I'm a firm believer that the stories we tell about the future actually shape the future. And what I've seen is that many things that we only a couple of years ago say would be impossible to do, changes we said that will never happen, things that we said we can never work that way or we could never implicate that, have suddenly in a number of weeks or months been implemented. Yeah. So from that perspective, I would say that the reference frame of impossible has changed, which is a good thing. And I just leave my answer to that, because the problematic things are many, but I think
that's a great answer, Mikko. Yeah. I mean, the reason I was asking that question is, at the beginning of the pandemic, you suddenly saw these images of lack of pollution, clean air, birds,
exactly,
all of that.
All strategic documents were like out from the window.
Yes, exactly. You suddenly saw this clarity for one moment. I just wanted to know, and of course it's not unfortunately the case, whether these moments were really transformative. I remember a Turin doctor in the height of the pandemic saying, I want to remember this moment because it really showed me what we need to do. Anyway, my final question, my friends, is whether the SDGs, in fact, and you may not be able to answer this, but just give your take on it, are a good framework for thinking through what sustainable governance is. And I think what we mean by that is all those elements of the SDGs are all elements that I suppose we have to address.
Okay.
Anything?
Yeah, I can start.
Or Mikko, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. I think it's a fantastic framework because it gives us a shared language and a shared framework globally. But as a blueprint for the action, it doesn't really work. So it's a fantastic framework, but not a good blueprint. And I think the reason is that it's actually articulated for nations and not for cities. So it's designed for nations. So there's a lot of focus on how to change policies or legal stuff or that kind of things, but it's not very good blueprint for action. So I think each city needs to convert the framework into their local action list. And so as a framework, great. As a blueprint, not so much.
Framework, great. Blueprint, no. Susan, over to you if that's okay.
Yeah, very much agree. I think it's about, mapping the intention of those goals across to your own local vision and strategy as a city. So totally agree there. The second thing I would say is that it doesn't necessarily give us the goals or framework for what we've talked about today, which is the sort of process or the way of change, in terms of governance. So we've talked a lot about culture and hierarchies and power and institutional boundaries, and it doesn't really give us a lot of guidance on that. So I think there's a sort of another layer that's required as well.
Yeah, thanks. Jürgen, what about you?
Yeah, I think we wouldn't talk together if we wouldn't have the SDGs. Yeah, so that's for me a frame, like you said, and it's a good frame, but it's like you said, Mikko, it's not an action-oriented plan, and it lacks for me in a way the vision. Yeah, but for me it's the strategic level, and it's a communication tool for discussing a lot of very, very important topics. So I'm very enthusiastic about the SDGs.
Yeah. And you, Eric, do you think, what have you got to say about the SDGs?
Well, I agree with what has been said, but I mean, they are what they are. And the big advantage of that is that if you agree with them, you agree that the system as it is not sustainable. which is of course already, I mean, in day-to-day politics and day-to-day discussion, I don't think this is a hegemonic position. In the pandemic, a lot of people want to go back to January 2020 before the lockdown and do not use it as a leverage of change. So the discussion about systemic change is put on the table. But I also agree at the level of priorities, which is politics, because there is something for everybody. So everybody is in the SDGs now, but what about migration? What about the pace of climate measures, etc., etc.? And so at that level, and Charles, I mean, I think I have to say that if cities are not involved in designing them, nation states are not capable mentally of designing action-oriented designs. Why? Because the complexity of let's say the real structure, the transversal translation of it can only be made case per case. Because of course SDGs are questions of mobility, of clean air, of spatial organization. And then of course a city like Brussels or a city like Helsinki in the relationship with nature is totally different. You cannot globally design that.
Define that, yeah.
And that design needs, and so the UN, and we are engaged in that, a global parliament of mayors as a representation of the urban vision on global matters is necessary, and that's still to be realized.
Yeah, I think what we've realized partly through all of this and what you've said, just picking up some words, is obviously the systems change thing, because I think we realize that our economic order and way of life is materially expansive, socially divisive, and environmentally hostile. And that clearly leads to collapse in some way unless we address it through the topics we've had. Yeah. So look, friends, that was a great conversation. I loved it, listening to you and all of that. So political issues are at the forefront. We need to use verbs rather than big fat nouns. So it's governing sustainably. So thank you very much, all of you, and hope to see you in real life soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Hope to get to Europe soon.
Yeah, I hope so. Anyway, I hope we meet somewhere, really. Yeah, I really mean it.
You're all welcome to Helsingborg next summer between May 30 and July 6, where we have the H22 City Expo, which is focusing on municipality or city innovation and SDGs.
Oh, wonderful.
Good. Great. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.
Good night.
Bye.